Professor once again, Dr. Benjamin Cabrera, and today our lesson will be on physiology, the hormonal regulation of calcium and phosphate metabolism, and the parathyroid gland. Calcium and phosphate are essential to human life because they play important structural roles in hard tissues like bones and teeth, and important regulatory roles in metabolic and signaling pathways. In the blood, most phosphate exists in the ionized form as phosphoric acid, which is called your inorganic phosphate or capital P small I. And for the purpose of this lecture, the inorganic phosphate or capital P and I will just be called phosphate. The two primary sources of calcium and phosphate would be the diet and guess what? The skeleton. The two hormones, the active vitamin D or the 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D, otherwise called your calcitriol, which is produced in the kidney, along with the parathyroid hormone produced in the parathyroid gland, will regulate in the intestinal absorption of both calcium and phosphate and release the calcium and phosphate in the circulation after bone resorption. Thus, your parathyroid and your calcitriol are the two physiologically most important hormones that are dedicated to the maintenance of normal levels of your calcium and phosphate in humans. Thus, they are called your calciotrophic hormones. Now let's talk about vitamin D3. So this is a beautiful representation of the structural formula for vitamin D3. This figure would like to represent the biosynthesis of the 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D. So the 7-dihydrocholesterol, which is found in the skin, will be acted upon by the light, the UV light, to form vitamin D3 or the cholecalciferol. Then hydroxylation will take place in the liver, first hydroxylation, to produce 25-hydroxycholecalciferol or 25-OHD3, and further second hydroxylation will happen in the kidney to produce 1,25-dihydroxy-D3 and 24,25-dihydroxy-D3. Okay, so the vitamin D and its metabolites circulate in the blood, bound to the vitamin D binding protein, or DBP, not Development Bank of the Philippines, but vitamin D binding protein. So DBP is a serum glycoprotein that is synthesized in the liver, and DBP will bind more than 85% of the 1,25-hydroxyvitamin D and 24,25 here dihydroxyvitamin D. Because of binding to other proteins, only 0.4% of 1,25-dihydroxyvitamin D circulates as free hormones. DBP transports the highly lipophilic vitamin D in the blood and provides a reservoir of vitamin D that protects against vitamin D deficiency. So DBP-bound vitamin D metabolites have circulating half-life of around several hours. So the next image would be a clear one, because in here this is a figure that now simply uh, will discuss the vitamin D metabolism. So in the skin, in the basal keratocyte, where your 7-dihydroxycholesterol is produced, okay, it will be acted upon by the light with the ultraviolet light to produce your vitamin D3, and it will be absorbed in the circulation, attached to vitamin D binding protein and vitamin D chylomicron. And also, the vitamin D that is absorbed in the gut, okay, in the gut, the enterocytes, it will be either vitamin D3, dietary vitamin D3, or vitamin D2. Okay, so they will be absorbed in the enterocytes and will be delivered in the circulation via the lymphatic and the portal. Lymphatic with your vitamin D chylomicron, and the portal with your attached to the vitamin D binding protein. Thus, with this one, the vitamin D will be brought to the liver to be processed in the hepatocyte for their first hydroxylation. Okay, so the first hydroxylation of your vitamin D with the action of the enzyme 25-hydroxylase to produce 25-hydroxyvitamin D. Then again, this 25-hydroxyvitamin D will circulate to the via the peripheral blood and be transported to the kidney, which is attached again to the vitamin D binding protein, and the second hydroxylation happens in the kidney with the 7-hydroxyvitamin D through the action of the 24-hydroxylase will now produce the 24-25-dihydroxyvitamin D. Then the 25-dihydroxyvitamin D will be acted upon by alpha-1 hydroxylase. So there are actually three enzymes involved: the 24-hydroxylase and the alpha-1 hydroxylase and another 24-hydroxylase. Once the 25-hydroxylase hydroxyvitamin D will be converted to the 125-dihydroxyvitamin D via the action of your 1-alpha hydroxylase, it will now again be acted upon by 24-hydroxylase and now producing the 1,24,25 trihydroxyvitamin D. Now the 1,25-hydroxyvitamin D will be absorbed again in the circulation, and it will now exert its biological effect on the gut, the bone, and the kidney and other areas. Now let's talk about the parathyroid hormone. And of course, the parathyroid hormone is produced by the parathyroid glands, and these are beautiful representation or anatomy for the parathyroid glands. So parathyroid glands are just 4 small masses of epithelial tissues embedded in the connective tissue capsule on the posterior part of the surface of the thyroid glands. The parathyroid hormone, along with vitamin D3, as I earlier mentioned, will function to regulate intestinal absorption of both calcium and inorganic phosphate, and also with their release into the circulation after bone resorption or destruction. So, this action of the parathyroid and vitamin D3 will protect us against hypocalcemia. And the primary target organs would be the bone and the kidney. Thereby, it exerts a positive feed-forward loop by stimulating the production of your vitamin D3. Thus, the action of the parathyroid hormone can only be opposed by calcitonin. Now let's talk about calcitonin. So calcitonin is produced by the parafollicular cells or the C cells of the thyroid gland. It will primarily act on the bone and kidney, and the action of calcitonin is to lower calcium and inorganic phosphate by inhibiting bone resorption. In the clinics, it is a useful marker for the thyroid cancer and can treat conditions like Paget's disease. So what is Paget's disease? Paget's disease is a condition wherein there is excessive bone turnover due to large and bizarre osteoclasts, and calcitonin will suppress this osteoclastic activity. Now let's talk about calcium. Calcium is important in bone formation, in the process of cell division and growth, in the mechanism of blood coagulation, important in the hormone response coupling and electrical stimulus response coupling. 99% of calcium are found in the bone, and only 1% is found in the extracellular fluid. Now, if there is low ionized calcium, it will bring about a condition of hypocalcemia, and the effect would be an increase in the excitability of nerve cells and muscle cells, leading to the condition of tetany. Okay, that's on the case of low ionized calcium or hypocalcemia. But in reverse, the elevated levels of your ionized calcium or hypercalcemia may decrease neuromuscular excitability or produce cardiac dysrhythmia, lethargy and disorientation, and even death. For calcium homeostasis, the bones stores a large amount of calcium and inorganic phosphate. Once maximal bone mass has been achieved in adult, the skeleton is constantly remodeled through the concerted activities of bone cells. The process of bone formation or accretion and bone resorption are in balance in healthy, physically active, and well-nourished individual. Thus, 1 kilogram of calcium are found in bones, immobilized in bones. Okay. And about 500 milligram, that is 0.5% of skeletal calcium, is immobilized from and deposited in the bone each day. However, the process of bone remodeling can be modulated to provide a net gain of or loss of calcium and phosphate in the blood, and is responsive to physical activity. Now, there are three forms of circulating calcium. One would be free ionized calcium, which account for 50%, and protein-bound calcium, and the rest will be of protein-bound calcium and calcium complex with other anions like your phosphates, bicarbs, and citrate. So there should always be an equal and balanced distribution of calcium between the bone and the extracellular fluid. Now this is a beautiful overview of the calcium homeostasis. Now a typical diet will contain around 1,500 mg of calcium, and in this diet, okay, you'll see that there will always be balance. So there is around 1,300 milligrams that are not absorbed, okay, and goes through the feces. Okay, and the absorption of calcium will be facilitated by the levels of calcitriol. If there's much need of calcium, the level would increase, and thus increasing the absorption of calcium in the intestine. But however, in normal condition, okay, we just absorb around 200 milligrams. So it now goes to the calcium pool. Okay, thus it will now go for the formation of bone through the action of calcitonin. Okay. So calcitriol, your vitamin D, will facilitate absorption in the intestine, increasing your calcium pool, and calcitonin now will deposit this absorbed calcium to the bone. In the need for balance of calcium and phosphate in the blood levels, there will be the action of both your parathyroid hormone and your calcitriol, which will induce bone resorption, again to increase the calcium pool. Again, and this goes to the kidney. Your parathyroid hormone, your calcitonin and calcitriol all will inhibit now the excretion of your calcium in the kidney. But in normal conditions, okay, if there is no need for much calcium in the body, now you can see the urine will be producing around 200 milligrams, so there will always be a balance. Okay, you take in 1,005, 1,003 is lost in the feces, and 1,200 will be lost in the kidney after all the processes inside the body. Thus, the total calcium is determined by the relative amounts of calcium absorbed by the gastrointestinal tract and excreted by the kidneys. The gastrointestinal tract absorbs calcium through the active carrier-mediated transport mechanism, okay, with calcitriol. And net calcium absorption is normally around 200 milligrams, but it can increase, as I told you earlier, to even 600 milligrams per day when calcitriol levels rise. Thus, in adults, calcium excretion by the kidneys equals the amount of absorbed by the gastrointestinal tract, okay, which is around 200 milligrams per day, and it changes in parallel with the reabsorption of calcium by the gastrointestinal tract. Thus, calcium balance is maintained because the amount of calcium ingested in an average diet, around 1,005, equals the amount lost in the feces, which is 1,300, and that lost in the urine, which is 200 milligrams per day. Now this is a graph or a figure which represents the effects of plasma calcium on the plasma levels of both your parathyroid and your calcitonin. The parathyroid is secreted by the parathyroid glands, and its secretion is regulated by the amount of calcium in the extracellular fluid. So in the event that there's a decrease, this is your calcium level, there's a decrease of calcium in the extracellular fluid or in the plasma, and there will be an increase in the secretion of your parathyroid hormone by the parathyroid gland. Thus, it will try to increase now the plasma calcium by stimulating, parathyroid will stimulate bone resorption, so the destruction of bones, to produce calcium, thus increasing the calcium reabsorption and increasing the calcium reabsorption of the kidneys too. And in the kidneys, it will be stimulated to produce your calcitriol or your active vitamin D, which will in turn increase the absorption of gastrointestinal calcium, okay, and facilitate the parathyroid-mediated bone resorption. However, on the other hand, calcitonin is secreted in response to an increased level of your calcium, and calcitonin is secreted by the thyroid cells or your parafollicular cells, okay, and secretion is stimulated by hypercalcemia. Calcitonin decreases plasma calcium now, so in response to hyperglycemia, will decrease plasma calcium by stimulating bone formation, or that is deposition of calcium into the bone. Is it clear? Now, this is the calcium transport along the nephron. So, the percentages will refer to the amount of calcium filtered then reabsorbed. Okay, so in each segment of the nephron, so in the proximal tubule, around 70% will be absorbed. Okay, will be filtered and reabsorbed. In the thick ascending limb, around 20% will be filtered and reabsorbed, and in the distal tubule, approximately around 9%, okay, will be filtered and reabsorbed. In the cortical collecting duct, around 1% will be filtered and reabsorbed, and only around approximately 1% will be excreted, going through the inner medullary collecting duct. So that's how efficient our nephron in reabsorption or bringing back calcium in the circulation. So in here is the summary of hormones and factors that will affect reabsorption of calcium. So we will be talking about the proximal tubules, thick ascending limb, around 70%, 20%, and around 9%. Okay, so are absorbed in these areas. So in the factor of volume expansion, there will be a decrease in the absorption of calcium, in decrease in both your proximal tubule and your distal tubule, but no effect on the thick ascending limb. In conditions of calcemia, in the case of hypercalcemia, there will be a decrease on all three areas of the nephron, both the proximal, thick ascending, and the distal tubule. Okay. In cases of hypocalcemia, there will be increase in all areas. In case of phosphate loading, no effect on the proximal and thick, but it is noted that there's an increase in the distal tubule, just like in the phosphate depletion in the distal tubule. Thus, the reaction of either there will be high levels of phosphate in relation to calcium. It is the distal tubule that reacts, okay, in conditions of acidosis, again, the distal tubule, and so as with your alkalosis. With acidosis, it decreases. With alkalosis, it increases. Now, with the presence of your parathyroid hormone, there's a decrease in the proximal tubule reabsorption of calcium, while there's increase in both the thick ascending and in the distal tubule. The presence of vitamin D, there is an increase in the distal tubule, and in the presence of the antagonist of this the above hormones, it will tend to increase the reabsorption of the ascending limb and increase the reabsorption in the distal tubule. Now let's talk about phosphorus. Phosphorus or phosphate is an important component of many organic molecules like your DNA, RNA, adenosine triphosphate or ATP, and intermediates of metabolic pathways. And also phosphate is a major constituent of the bone. It's very important in bone formation and resorption. So the existing ionized form of phosphate that is free in the body would be your inorganic phosphate. The urinary phosphate or inorganic phosphate is an important buffer, or also labeled as titrable acids, for the maintenance of the acid-base balance. Majority or 86% of phosphates are found in the bone, and only 40% are in the intracellular fluid, and around a small amount like 0.03% is in the extracellular fluid. The normal plasma level of inorganic phosphates is around 4 milligrams per deciliter. So this is the overview of your inorganic phosphate homeostasis. Again, just like your calcium, so there will be dietary phosphate, okay? The amount of dietary phosphate is approximately 1,400, and around 500 will be not be absorbed. No, they will go directly to the feces, and in the intestine, the phosphate will be absorbed by the action of your calcitriol or vitamin D3, okay, to increase the level of your phosphate pool, and the calcitonin from the kidney now will induce the formation, thus decreasing the amount of plasma phosphate, because it will now induce the formation of bone and soft tissues. While the action of both the parathyroid and calcitriol vitamin D, if there's a need to increase your phosphate in the phosphate pool, will now induce bone resorption, as increasing the phosphate pool. So the phosphate pool will be the phosphates will be filtered to the kidneys, okay, and excretion can either be increased or decreased by the action of the opposing forces, like your parathyroid with calcitonin will tend to increase the excretion of phosphate, while the calcitriol, because it would like to deposit more phosphate in the bone, will inhibit its secretion. In a normal individual, in a balanced individual, the urine level of urine phosphate excreted would be 900 milligrams. So still, you see, there is balance. Okay, you took in 1004, you poop 500. In normal situation, you will urinate 900, so that would be 1400. Again, so just like your calcium, this is the filtration reabsorption, okay, of the of phosphate in the nephron by percentage. So still, majority of your phosphates will be filtered and reabsorbed in the proximal tubule, none in the loop of Henle, but in the distal tubule there will be approximately 10% will be filtered and reabsorbed, and higher than calcium, around 10% will be excreted in the inner medullary collecting duct. So in calcium, it's around 1% will be excreted under normal condition, while in phosphate, around 10% will be excreted under normal condition. So this diagram teaches us how phosphate is reabsorbed in the proximal tubule. So this is in the proximal tubule, which accounts around 80%, okay, of phosphate filtration and reabsorption. So this is your tubular fluid, okay. So inside the tubules, so 3 molecules of sodium with 1 molecule of inorganic phosphate will be absorbed, okay, in the proximal tubular cells through the 3 sodium 1 phosphate symporter, and your phosphate will exit the cell through the p anion antiporter, and this will be transported back to the blood and reabsorbed and transported back to the blood. Is it clear? So before we end, let us talk about this table that summarizes the hormones and factors affecting the ionized inorganic phosphate reabsorption, or ionized phosphate reabsorption by the proximal tubule. So there are 3 columns: the factor or hormone, the rate of occurrence, and the proximal tubule reabsorption. So these are the factors and hormone. In conditions of volume expansion, it will induce decrease of reabsorption, okay, of phosphate in the proximal tubule. In cases of hypercalcemia, so if it is acute, it will tend to increase reabsorption, but if it is chronic, it will now tend to decrease reabsorption in the proximal tubule. In conditions of phosphate loading, meaning too much phosphate was taken in, so the action of so there will be high phosphate in the system, so the action of your proximal tubule, just to balance it, would be to decrease now reabsorption means absorbing it again and putting it into the blood, okay. And in cases of phosphate depletion, okay, now the opposite will affect, okay. There will be an increase in the reabsorption of phosphate in the proximal tubule. In conditions of metabolic acidosis, if it is chronic, it will tend to decrease the reabsorption of phosphate in the proximal tubule. In cases of a chronic metabolic alkalosis, it will tend to increase, okay, the proximal tubule reabsorption of your phosphate. In the presence of your parathyroid hormone, it will decrease reabsorption, because what would you like? Would you like to lose phosphate, okay, with parathyroid hormone? While with an acute, okay, uh, high levels of vitamin D can tend to increase phosphate, okay, absorption, reabsorption in the proximal tubule, but chronic, okay, high levels of vitamin D will now has an opposite effect of decreasing the reabsorption in the proximal tubule. The presence of growth hormone will increase, okay. The presence of your FGF23 and FGF24 will tend to decrease, and the presence of your glucocorticoids, maybe exogenous, will tend to decrease. So that's it, folks. So that's it's my students. We're done. I hope you I'll be posting it in my YouTube channel, so for your asynchronous activity, or you can go back and review it. So for those who have not subscribed, please subscribe in my YouTube channel. You can share it, click the thumbs up button, and click the notification button so you'll be notified whenever I will be posting another lecture. So that's it. Thank you very much.